pale light filtered through the narrow windows of Ironwood State Prison, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate the grim events unfolding within the cold concrete walls. The rhythmic sound of guards' footsteps echoed through the long hallways, a haunting reminder of the system that held him captive. John Carter lay quietly in his small solitary cell, the weight of exhaustion etched deeply on his face. Once a free man, a husband, a father, and a loyal companion to his dog Max, John's life had drastically changed. Now the only thing that remained in his heart was the longing to see his beloved dog one last time before his execution. After 5 long years, his world had shrunk to these gray walls, and his last remaining connection to humanity was his memories of Max, a German shepherd who had been his constant companion and source of comfort before everything fell apart. As dawn broke that day, John knew that his time was nearly up. In just a few short hours, he would be moved to the final holding cell, adjacent to the execution room, where the lethal injection would be administered. Alone in his thoughts, with no family to visit, only the occasional presence of the prison chaplain, Reverend Morris, his only wish was simple: to see Max. He whispered it over and over to the guards, his voice rough, his throat aching with a need for something, anything that could make this last moment more bearable. "I just want to see Max before I go," he repeated softly, the words heavy with emotion, his final plea for the comfort of his dog's familiar presence. Warden Sarah Collins entered the room, her posture stiff, but there was a flicker of compassion hidden behind the professional distance. She knew the request was unusual, perhaps even impossible, but there was something in John's eyes, a raw vulnerability, that made her pause. "John Carter, final requests are subject to approval," she began, her voice cool and composed. "Bringing an animal onto prison grounds is highly irregular. We don't even know where Max is." "I know where he is," John interrupted, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Max has been with Emily, my fiancée. She's been taking care of him all this time." His words hung in the air, and the ache in his throat betrayed the exhaustion he had been trying to conceal. "Please, Warden, if there's any mercy left in this world, let me see Max." There was a long pause as Warden Collins studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "I'll see what I can do, but don't get your hopes up." John nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he silently accepted the weight of his situation. What did it matter? In a few hours, the needle would do its grim work. But for now, all he could do was hold on to this last thread of hope, the one final connection to the world that had once been his. As Warden Collins left, the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance, leaving John alone once more. The silence in the cell was oppressive, thick with the weight of the coming hours. He shifted slightly, but the chains around his ankles rattled with every movement, a constant reminder of his confinement. The dull sound seemed to echo louder than the ticking of the clock above the door, marking the time slipping away. His gaze wandered to the small, high window, a tiny slit of light that barely captured the weak rays of the early morning sun. He couldn't see the sky, only a vague hint of pink as dawn broke over the horizon. It reminded him of the mornings he used to spend walking Max along the empty streets of Brooklyn, before everything changed. He could almost feel the warmth of the leash in his hand and hear Max's excited barks, his tail wagging as they headed to the park. It was a life that felt so far away now, a life that seemed almost impossible to imagine in this place. The thought of Max, his loyal dog, the only being who had never judged him, the one who had kept him going when everything else seemed lost, filled his heart with both warmth and unbearable sadness. Max had been more than a pet. He had been his lifeline, his family. John closed his eyes, letting the memory of Max's joyful barks and wagging tail flood his mind. He could almost hear people on the streets asking, "Did you train him yourself?" And his proud response, "Yes." Max had been brilliant, eager to please, always by his side, sharing quiet moments of companionship, and at times giving him the strength to carry on. But that life was gone now. The sound of the guard's knock on the door shattered his thoughts. "Carter, time to go. They're moving you to the final holding cell. Warden wants you prepped." The words hit John like a cold wave, a reminder of the finality that awaited him. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, and extended his wrists for the cuffs. The mechanical click of the metal was almost routine by now, a sound he had grown accustomed to over the years of confinement. "Let's move," the guard said curtly, avoiding John's gaze. As John shuffled to the door, he stole one last look at the small sliver of morning light. It was faint, but it was there, just like the faint hope in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he would get to see Max again before it was too late. Maybe that brief reunion would be the last piece of comfort he would carry with him into the unknown. John's last wish. As the guards led John down the cold, sterile corridors of Ironwood Prison, the faint echo of his footsteps felt heavier than ever. Each step took him closer to his final destination, the small, isolated holding cell just a few feet away from the execution room. The walls, painted in dull shades of blue and gray, seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the sense of inevitability. John felt a pang of fear in his chest, but it wasn't the fear of dying that gripped him. It was the fear of leaving this world without seeing Max, his dog, the one living being who had been with him through every high and low of his life. Max had been his friend, his confidant, and his anchor during the darkest moments of his imprisonment. He hadn't seen him in years, 5 long years since the trial, since the moment his world turned upside down. And now, in his last hours, the thought of not having that final reunion felt like a betrayal. "I just want to see him one last time," he muttered to the guard who walked beside him. His voice cracked, but there was no mistaking the pleading tone. He had asked for this for days now. It was the only request that meant anything to him anymore. His eyes burned with the memory of Max, of the days when they would walk together, talking about everything and nothing. His heart ached at the thought of the dog, so full of life, waiting for him somewhere, unaware of the fate that had befallen his owner. Warden Sarah Collins had made it clear earlier that it was an unusual request, one that wasn't normally granted. Bringing an animal onto prison grounds, especially for a man on death row, was unheard of. But John couldn't help himself. The image of Max's face, the joy in his eyes whenever John returned home after a long day, haunted him. He needed that one final moment, a connection to a life that had once been full of hope and love. When Warden Collins had left him earlier, she had promised to see what she could do, but cautioned him not to get his hopes up. John hadn't let himself believe it would happen. After all, he had spent 5 years fighting for his innocence, only to be silenced by a system that didn't want to listen. But now, in the quiet of his thoughts, he clung to a thread of hope. Max was the last piece of his former life, the last bit of normalcy he had left. As he reached the holding cell, the heavy metal door creaked open, and he was ushered inside. The room was stark, almost clinical. White tile floors, fluorescent lights overhead, and a single metal bunk. The coldness of it made John feel more alone than ever before. He had lived here, within these walls, for so long that it had become his reality. But now, in these final moments, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had been abandoned by everything except Max. He sat on the bunk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His mind raced with thoughts of Max. Would the dog still remember him? Would he even recognize him after all this time? John had always told himself that Max would wait for him, that the bond they shared was unbreakable. But now, with the end so close, he feared it wasn't true. He had been a shadow of himself for so long. Would his dog still see the man who had once been his best friend, or would the years apart have changed everything? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A voice came from the other side. "Carter, we've got a response from the department. The warden says, we can bring the dog in, but you've got 1 hour. Make it count." For a moment, John couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest and his head spun with disbelief. Could it be true? Was he really going to see Max again? In a daze, he stood up, his legs shaky from the weight of the moment. He felt the cold metal cuffs around his wrists, but they no longer seemed to matter. All that mattered now was that Max was coming. He could almost see it. Max bounding toward him, tail wagging wildly, jumping into his arms, as if no time had passed at all. He glanced out the small window in his cell, the morning light just beginning to break through the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe this was the one good thing that would come from it all, the one moment of grace he could hold on to as he faced the end. Reunion with Max time seemed to stretch and warp in that small holding cell. John's mind raced with anticipation. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, yet it also felt like the longest minute of his life, filled with a nervous hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He stood by the door, pacing back and forth, the sound of his boots tapping rhythmically against the cold, hard floor. Then, finally, a loud knock echoed through the door. "Carter, it's time!" came the guard's voice, gruff but with a hint of something else, something like sympathy, or perhaps shared understanding. John's heart raced as he turned toward the door, his breath shallow. The door creaked open, and for a brief second he saw Warden Collins standing there, her face unreadable, but her eyes softer than usual. Behind her, through the door, he saw the figure he had been longing for, the figure that had been the light in his darkest days. Max. The German shepherd's eyes locked onto John immediately, and a low whimper escaped from the dog's throat. Max's tail began to wag furiously, his body trembling with excitement as he pulled at the leash held by Emily Davis, John's fiancée. For a moment, John stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight of his dog. Time seemed to stop entirely. The air felt thick, as if the universe itself had taken a breath and held it. And then, without warning, Max bolted forward, the leash taut in Emily's hand, and leapt onto John with a joy that sent tears flooding to his eyes. "Oh my God, Max!" John whispered hoarsely as he dropped to his knees, the cold concrete floor pressing into his skin. Max licked his face, his big paws pushing against John's chest, as if trying to climb into his arms again, to be as close as possible. The dog's excitement was infectious. John laughed through his tears, holding Max as tight as he could, letting the warmth of the dog's fur and the rhythmic beating of his heart fill the space between them. Emily stepped back, wiping her own tears, her face a mixture of sadness and relief. "I knew he would remember you," she said softly, her voice trembling. John could barely respond. He was lost in the moment, feeling the solid weight of Max in his arms, the familiar, comforting scent of his dog filling his senses. It was as if the world outside the walls of the prison no longer existed. There was no trial, no wrongful conviction, no impending execution. There was only Max, the symbol of everything he had lost, and now, the symbol of everything he might still have, even if only for this one brief, fleeting moment. "Thank you," John whispered to Emily, his voice cracking. "I never thought I'd get to see him again. Thank you." But as he held Max, the weight of reality began to press in once more. The guards were standing by, their presence an ever-present reminder that time was running out. 15 minutes, one of the guards called out from the door, the words cutting through the haze of warmth and emotion like a dagger. John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't waste these last moments. He needed to remember every detail, Max's happy barks, the way the dog's fur felt under his fingers, the way Max kept licking his face as if he couldn't believe he was here either. "Stay with me, boy," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay with me just a little longer." The bond between them was palpable, and in that moment, it was the only thing that mattered. Nothing else mattered. Not the execution, not the wrongful conviction, not the years lost. For these precious moments, there was only love, pure, unbroken, and untainted by the world outside.
As Max calmed down, resting his head in John's lap, the sound of the guard's footsteps growing louder outside the cell door, John allowed himself one final, fleeting moment of peace. "Thank you for waiting for me, Max," he whispered, the tears falling freely now. "I couldn't have gotten through it without you." And as the final moments ticked away, John stayed there, holding Max, silently thanking the universe for granting him this one last wish, this one final connection to the life he had once known. A shocking turn of events. The guard's voice broke through the stillness, his words sharp and deliberate. "Carter, your time is almost up. We need to take Max." Reluctantly, John released Max, his fingers brushing the dog's soft fur one last time. The German shepherd whined, as if understanding the separation, his eyes locking onto John's with a pleading gaze that made the ache in John's chest feel even heavier. "No, not yet," John whispered desperately, his voice choked with emotion. But the guards were already at the door, preparing to pull Max away. In that moment, John felt an overwhelming sense of loss. He had always known this day would come, but he hadn't anticipated the agony of having to say goodbye, even if just for a moment. Then, as the guard reached for Max's leash, something extraordinary happened. The door to the cell opened abruptly, and a voice called out from the corridor. "Stop! Wait!" John blinked, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was familiar. Warden Sarah Collins stepped into the room, her face tense, but her eyes gleaming with something unexpected. Hope. "What's going on?" John asked, his voice trembling. "I've just received new information," she said quickly, her tone more urgent than before. "There's a possibility that your execution could be delayed." For a moment, John didn't understand. His mind was still clouded by the overwhelming emotions of the reunion with Max. Max was still standing by him, looking up at him with those loyal eyes. He didn't want to let go. He didn't want this moment to end. "Delayed?" John asked in disbelief, his heart beginning to race. "What do you mean?" Warden Collins gave him a look that was both grave and compassionate. "There are some new developments in your case. We're looking into evidence that was previously overlooked. It's not confirmed yet, but there's a chance it could lead to a stay of execution." John's breath caught in his throat. Was it possible? Was there truly hope after all these years of silence and despair? "Wait," he said, looking down at Max, then back at Warden Collins. "What does this mean for me? Am I being granted more time?" Warden Collins nodded. "I can't make any promises yet, but we've been given a brief window, a 2-hour stay, to investigate further. We need to verify the new evidence, but it's enough time to put a halt to the execution for now. They'll be re-examining the case, looking at new leads that have surfaced." John felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The certainty of death that had hovered over him for so long suddenly seemed distant, unreal. He glanced down at Max, whose tail began to wag again, sensing that something had changed. The dog's body language shifted from confusion to cautious hope, as if he too understood that there was still time. "Does that mean I'm not going to die today?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart pounded in his chest, racing with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Not today," Warden Collins replied softly, her voice almost as filled with wonder as his. "Not today. It was a miracle, or at least, it felt like one. Can I still keep Max with me for these 2 hours?" John asked, his eyes pleading with her, unwilling to let go of the dog after everything that had just happened. The warden hesitated, then finally nodded. "I'll allow it. Just for a little longer. We need to make sure that no one interferes, though, so this has to be brief." John smiled through the tears that welled up in his eyes, his chest tight with the overwhelming weight of gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured. With a final nod from Warden Collins, she left the room, and John was left alone with Max once more. For the next 2 hours, the world outside his cell faded away. The sound of his heartbeat, the presence of Max by his side, those were the only things that mattered. It felt like the universe was giving him another chance. A brief moment of reprieve before everything returned to the harsh reality of the world outside these walls. But for now, he had Max, and that was enough. For now, the world outside the prison could wait. And in those fleeting moments, John held on to Max like he had never held him before. Grateful, hopeful, and full of life again, if only for a while longer. The final moments of hope. The 2 hours that followed felt like a dream, too precious and fleeting to fully grasp. John sat on the narrow bunk in the holding cell, Max lying by his feet, occasionally nudging his hand for attention, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The dog's presence was like a balm to his soul, soothing the jagged edges of fear and uncertainty that had haunted him for so long. For the first time in years, John allowed himself to forget about the execution. He pushed aside the impending fate that still loomed over him like a shadow, choosing instead to bask in the warmth of Max's companionship. The dog, who had once been his only solace, now became his source of strength in a way he hadn't imagined possible. Each gentle lick of Max's tongue on his hand, every soft whine or joyful wag of the tail, made John feel like he had been granted a final, beautiful gift from the world, a moment to feel truly alive again, even if it was only for a short time. Emily Davis, standing quietly by the door, watched the reunion unfold with a quiet sense of awe. She knew how much this meant to John, how deeply the bond between him and Max ran. It was more than just a pet and owner. It was a connection built on years of trust and loyalty, a love that had survived even the darkest of times. "I can't believe this is happening," Emily whispered, her voice breaking as she took a tentative step closer. John turned his head to meet her eyes, his expression full of gratitude and wonder. I didn't think I'd ever get to see him again, Em. It's the only thing that's kept me going all this time. Emily nodded, her own tears glistening as she watched Max nuzzle John's face. You deserve this, John. You deserve to have some peace, even if it's just for these few moments. The seconds ticked by in a blur of quiet reflection. John and Max shared a bond that no one else could fully understand, a bond that transcended the walls of prison, the cruelty of the system, and the harshness of his wrongful conviction. As he stroked Max's fur, memories of their life together before all of this began flooded back. The early mornings they spent walking through Brooklyn, the long nights when Max had stayed by his side after a tough day, the way the dog had always been there, unwavering in his loyalty. For John, these memories were a lifeline, reminding him of who he was before the world had tried to break him. They reminded him that despite everything, the isolation, the injustice, the years of fighting for his life, there was still love in the world. There was still kindness, still loyalty, still hope. But even as John savored these final moments, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Warden Collins had granted him this small reprieve, but the clock was ticking, and there was no guarantee of what would come next. Would the new evidence hold up? Would the delay lead to a real chance at exoneration? Or would John be forced to face the execution he had been dreading for so long? The question lingered in the back of his mind, but for now, he chose to push it away. He allowed himself to exist in this brief, stolen moment of peace, surrounded by the unconditional love of Max and the woman who had never given up on him. Max let out a soft bark, as if to say, "Let's not think about tomorrow, John. Let's just be here, together, now." John smiled through his tears, brushing the dog's fur gently. "We're together now, boy. That's all that matters." As the minutes stretched on, the door to the cell opened again, but this time, it was Detective Michael Harris who stepped inside, his face serious. "John," he said, his voice low and tense, "there's been a break in the case. We've found something important." The words caught John by surprise. He stood up, his heart racing again. "What? What do you mean?" Michael Harris looked at him with a mixture of regret and determination. "We found evidence that wasn't available at your trial. Financial records, phone records, that suggest Mark Turner and others may have been involved in framing you. The new evidence is strong enough to put a stop to the execution." A wave of shock, disbelief, and overwhelming hope crashed over John. Could this really be happening? After all this time, was he finally going to be given a chance at justice? "You're not going to die today," Detective Harris continued, his voice steady. "We've secured a temporary stay of execution. The governor's office is reviewing the new evidence. There's a chance, just a chance, that your conviction could be overturned." For a brief, fleeting moment, John felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. He looked at Emily, and her eyes, wide with hope, spoke more than words ever could. "We have time," John whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "We have time." Max barked happily, as if he understood. John knelt down, pulling the dog into his arms once again. His heart was racing, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would get a second chance at life. And for now, that was enough. For now, John had hope. The unexpected turn of fate. The air in the holding cell felt heavier now, the overwhelming sense of hope clashing with the tension that was still very much present. Even with the new evidence and the temporary stay of execution, John knew better than to believe everything was certain. The system had been unforgiving for years. What if this was just another false promise? Yet, as he looked at Emily and Max, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The faintest glimmer of belief that he might actually walk out of this place a free man. Still holding Max, John turned to Detective Harris, his heart pounding in his chest. "So, what happens now? What do we do next?" The detective's face was grim, but there was a spark of something in his eyes. Determination, perhaps. "We wait. The governor's office has been informed, and the district attorney is reviewing the new evidence. But it's not going to be easy. We're up against powerful people, and if this leads to a full investigation, there will be pushback." John nodded, absorbing the weight of Harris's words. Even though he felt a surge of hope, the reality of the situation settled back in. This could be a small victory, but it was far from over. Just as John opened his mouth to speak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, heavy and purposeful. The door to the cell opened once again, and Warden Sarah Collins entered, her face serious. She gave a brief glance at Emily, who was standing beside John, her hand still resting on his arm, as if to reassure him that she was still there, fighting alongside him. "I've spoken to the governor's office," Warden Collins said. "They're giving us 2 more hours. A stay, not a guarantee of anything permanent, but it's time to dig deeper into the new evidence." John's heart skipped a beat. 2 hours. It felt like a lifetime and a heartbeat all at once. He glanced at Emily, who squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes wide with hope, but there was an unspoken fear in her gaze as well. After everything, after the years of fighting, the loneliness, the lies, they were so close to something real. John couldn't let himself believe it too fully, not yet. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the chains around his wrists once again. They were more than just physical, they were the invisible chains that had bound him for so long. But now, with the possibility of freedom hanging in the air, those chains felt lighter, almost insignificant. "I'll take those 2 hours," John said, his voice steadier than he had expected it to be. "I'll take whatever I can get." Emily reached up and wiped away a tear from the corner of her eye. "We'll make it through this. We will." Max, ever faithful, rested his head on John's foot, as though he sensed the importance of the moment. The dog had always been there for him, in ways that no human could. He was the one companion that had never turned away, even when the world had left John in the dark. Then, without a word, Warden Collins turned and motioned for John to follow her. She led him down the narrow corridor, past the rows of locked doors and high security cells. Each step seemed to take him further from the grim reality of his past and closer to a future that, for the first time in years, felt within reach. Emily followed closely behind, her presence a constant reminder of the love and support she had given him through everything. As they reached the small, dimly lit office where the temporary stay had been granted, Warden Collins stopped, turning to John. "I'll keep you updated. Stay calm, and remember, this isn't over, but it's the best we can do for now." John nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you for everything." The door closed behind them, and he was left alone with Emily and Max in the small, stark room. Time seemed to stretch on, each second feeling like an eternity. But in that moment, with Max lying quietly by his side, John felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The fear of death, the sorrow of being wrongfully convicted, all seemed to fade into the background. For now, there was just him, his dog, and the woman who had never given up on him. As the hours passed, John didn't allow himself to think too much about what might come next. He didn't allow himself to think about the court, about the officials making decisions behind closed doors. He focused on the feeling of Max's fur beneath his fingers, on the quiet moments with Emily, and the hope that was slowly growing in his chest. Suddenly, the door opened again. Warden Collins entered, a grim expression on her face, but this time, her eyes were different. There was a flicker of something, perhaps disbelief, perhaps triumph. "They've agreed to extend the stay," she said quietly. "We've got time. The investigation will continue, and for now, you're not going anywhere." In that instant, John felt the weight of 5 years of hopelessness lift. The world didn't feel so bleak anymore. Maybe he would be free, maybe he wouldn't, but for the first time, he had the chance to find out the truth. And for him, that was all that mattered. A glimmer of justice. The 2 hours had passed in what felt like a blur. John sat with his back against the cold wall of the small office, his mind racing, trying to keep the hope in check. Emily sat beside him, her hand still firmly in his, offering the silent reassurance he needed more than anything. Max, ever the loyal companion, rested quietly at John's feet, his head resting on John's lap as though sensing the shift in the air. Something was changing, something was happening, and it was all unfolding in these final moments. As Warden Collins re-entered the room, John's heart skipped a beat. The look on her face wasn't one of the cold professionalism she usually displayed. Instead, there was something else, a flicker of empathy, even a hint of disbelief in her eyes. "John," she said, her voice steady but softer than before. "I have news. It's not over." John looked at her, his breath catching in his chest. His throat felt tight. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Warden Collins took a breath before she spoke again. "The new evidence has caused a ripple. The district attorney is taking a second look at the case. They've found enough in the digital footprints, in the phone records, to warrant a full re-examination." For a moment, John couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had heard the word "stay" before. He had heard it whispered to him in passing, but it had always felt like a fleeting moment of false hope. Now, though, it was real. The words he had longed to hear for years were finally spoken aloud. "You're not going to die today, John. The execution has been suspended for 48 hours while the investigation continues. We're reopening the case." The flood of emotions that John felt was indescribable. Relief, disbelief, overwhelming joy mixed with the shadows of everything he had endured. His mind raced with the realization that he might actually have a future. He wasn't going to face that needle today. He wasn't going to die with a lie hanging over him. The chance for truth was within his reach. Emily let out a sob of relief, pulling him into a tight embrace. She was shaking, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You did it, John. We did it." The words barely made it through his throat, but he managed to speak. I didn't think this would happen. I thought it was over." His voice broke with emotion. Max shifted, nudging John's leg as if to remind him that in all of this, the dog had never left his side. John leaned down, wrapping his arms around Max, the only constant in a world that had tried to tear him apart. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered to the dog, his voice filled with gratitude. "You're the reason I've held on this long." Warden Collins cleared her throat softly. "We've still got a long way to go, John. This is just a temporary reprieve. The investigation is far from over, and there will be more challenges ahead. But for now, you're not leaving this world today, and that's something." John nodded, a smile slowly spreading across his face. For the first time in years, the weight of the world felt lighter. There was still a long road ahead, but he no longer felt like he was walking it alone. He had Max, Emily, and the hope that the truth would eventually come out. As Warden Collins left the room to handle the paperwork for the stay, Emily and John were left alone with their thoughts. A quiet, peaceful moment where everything was uncertain, but at the same time, full of possibility. They knew that this was just the beginning of something new, something that could finally lead to the justice John deserved. "Whatever happens next, Emily," John said, turning to her, his eyes full of gratitude, "thank you for never giving up on me. I never thought I'd see the light again, but you've kept it shining. And Max," he glanced down at his dog, who was now lying beside him, content and calm. "Max is the reason I've kept fighting." Emily smiled through her tears. "We're not done yet, John, but we'll get through this, together." For a moment, all the worries of the world faded away. There was no more death hanging over John. For now, there was just the quiet strength of his fiancée, the faithful love of his dog, and the uncertain but hopeful road ahead. John knew there were battles still to fight, but today, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that victory might be possible. And with Max by his side, he was ready to fight for it. The final step. The next 2 hours felt like a strange limbo, half hope, half uncertainty. John, Emily, and Max spent the time in the small holding room, the weight of the unexpected reprieve heavy on their shoulders. Warden Collins had given them the news of the stay, but the battle was far from over. They had time, but how much time? And would the new evidence be enough to bring about a real change? John couldn't stop his mind from racing. Every possible outcome ran through his head. What if the DA decided the new evidence wasn't strong enough? What if the higher-ups dismissed it, like they had dismissed his cries of innocence for so long? But then, as his gaze fell to Max, lying peacefully at his feet, something inside him steadied. For once, the fear didn't hold him captive. He realized that he couldn't waste another second thinking about what might go wrong. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he had his dog, his fiancée, and a chance to breathe, to hope. The door to the holding room opened, and Warden Collins stepped inside, her expression grim. But there was a flicker of something else, something like respect, something like relief in her eyes. She looked at John, then at Emily, and nodded slightly. "John," she began, her voice low and firm, "I've just received word that they've agreed to a full review of the case. The governor's office is taking it seriously. They're going to push for a formal investigation into the new evidence." John's heart skipped. Max lifted his head at the sound of his name, sensing the shift in the air. "What does that mean?" John asked, standing up quickly, his legs still a little shaky from the emotional toll of the day. "It means," Warden Collins said, her voice steady but with a hint of something warm, "that you're not going to die today. The investigation is opening up again, and they'll be taking a much closer look at the evidence. There's a chance, still slim, but a chance, that your conviction will be overturned." John blinked, a lump forming in his throat. He felt the world tilt, the weight of everything that had happened in the last 5 years crashing down on him all at once. The disbelief, the anger, the fear, it all seemed so far away in that moment. He couldn't even find the words. I don't know what to say," John whispered, the tears that had been held back finally falling. Thank you for not giving up on me." Emily stepped forward, her arms around him instantly. "We didn't give up, John, and we never will." Max whimpered as if he could feel the relief in the room. He licked John's hand, offering the same loyalty he had always given, never questioning, never doubting. John leaned down to rub the dog's ears, his heart swelling with love for the creature who had been the one constant in his life. "I'm not alone," he whispered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore." Warden Collins cleared her throat, bringing John back to reality. "I've secured your transfer back to a regular holding cell for now. We'll need to prepare for the next steps, but I'll keep you updated as soon as we know more." John nodded, still overwhelmed. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was no longer staring down his death. He was facing an uncertain future, yes, but it was one he could live through, one he could fight for. As Warden Collins left the room, John took a deep breath. He turned to Emily and Max. His two pillars of strength. "We've still got a lot to do," John said, his voice steady. "But today we've won something." Emily smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "And we'll keep winning, one step at a time." As John sat down, Max curled up at his feet, and Emily sat by his side. They all shared a quiet moment of peace. There was still uncertainty, still fear of what the future might hold. But for now, they had each other. And that, for the first time in years, felt like enough. The battle was far from over, but John had something more now, hope, and the belief that justice, though slow, could still find its way. And as he looked down at Max, his heart filled with the realization that he was no longer walking this path alone. Together, they would face whatever came next, step by step, one breath at a time. The fight for justice. The next few days passed in a blur. John was moved from the holding cell back to a regular prison wing, but the isolation still weighed heavily on him. He was grateful for the temporary stay, but the uncertainty was still palpable. The walls of Ironwood State Prison had always felt oppressive, but now, with the possibility of a new future ahead, they felt different. They felt like a cage holding him in the middle of a battle that wasn't over yet. He spent his time pacing, thinking, waiting for the next phone call, the next piece of news. His mind was always running, always wondering what would happen next. The days seemed to drag on with the same rhythm of routines, guards, meals, and more waiting. And yet, even in the mundane, John found himself holding on to the sliver of hope he had been given. Emily had been his rock. She visited him every day, bringing with her not just the promise of love and support, but a constant reminder that the fight wasn't over. She kept him updated on the investigation, on the new leads that were being explored, on the slowly growing pile of evidence that might finally clear his name. "John," she said one evening as she sat across from him, her voice filled with quiet determination. "They've found more. The financial records they uncovered showed Turner had ties to Mark Green, a known fixer with connections to some of the most powerful people in the city. It's all starting to come together." John felt a surge of emotion at her words. Finally, the truth was beginning to rise to the surface. For the first time, he could see the possibility of clearing his name, of being able to walk free again. It was something he had dreamed of, but it had always felt too distant, too impossible. Now it was within reach, "I never stopped believing it, Emily," John whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude and hope. "I never stopped believing I could prove I didn't do it. I just never thought it would happen." Emily reached across the table, her hand warm and reassuring as it gripped his. "You didn't give up, and neither did I." As the days passed, the investigation continued to uncover more damning evidence. Bank transfers, phone records, connections between Turner, Green, and the corrupt officials who had framed John. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and for the first time, it felt like justice might actually prevail. But the pressure was mounting. John knew that the authorities would fight to maintain the conviction. The people involved in his wrongful conviction had power, influence, and resources at their disposal. And if there was one thing John had learned during his time in prison, it was that the truth wasn't always enough to bring down the system. There was always a fight, a battle, and it was never over until it was truly over. The phone rang late one afternoon, and Emily quickly answered it, her expression shifting as she listened. John could tell it was something important by the way her eyes widened. "John," she said softly, her voice tense, "they found something big. The governor's office has agreed to grant a full review of the case. We're going to court." A wave of disbelief and cautious hope washed over John. The full review meant that the new evidence would finally be presented in front of a judge, that his case would be heard, that the truth would have a chance to stand in the light. "We're not done yet," John said, his voice steadier now. "We've come this far, and we're going all the way." And so, the fight for John's innocence intensified. Legal teams were mobilized, evidence was reviewed, and witnesses were called in to testify. It was a grueling process, but it was a process that held the promise of freedom at the end of it. Emily stood by his side, as she had from the beginning, offering him strength when he needed it most. The courtroom was a battleground. John sat at the defendant's table, no longer the condemned man he had once been, but a man fighting for his life, for his name, and for his future. Emily sat beside him, her hand in his, as they both faced the judges, the lawyers, and the evidence that would decide his fate. The prosecutor, Thomas Jurger, stood before the court, his voice confident but strained. He had been the one to prosecute John 5 years ago, but now, with the new evidence coming to light, he was forced to reckon with the possibility that he had sent an innocent man to death row. "We've all seen the records, the phone logs, the connections to Mark Green," Jurger said, his voice steady but tinged with discomfort. "The new evidence casts doubt on the integrity of the original conviction." For the first time, John felt the weight of those words not as a sentence, but as a chance. The truth was finally being heard. As the judge called for a recess to review the new evidence, John couldn't help but look at Emily. Her eyes were full of hope, but there was also a quiet anxiety. This was it. The moment they had fought for, dreamed of, was finally here. Would the judge see the truth? Would the justice system allow the wrongs to be righted? The next morning, the court reconvened. John sat, tense but hopeful, as the judge prepared to announce his decision. When the judge spoke, his words were clear and final. "After reviewing the new evidence and considering the arguments presented, it is clear that the original conviction is no longer valid. The court hereby vacates the conviction of John Carter. The defendant is to be released immediately." Tears filled John's eyes as the reality of the moment set in. The fight was over. He was free. As the courtroom erupted in applause, John turned to Emily and pulled her into a tight embrace. He felt Max nudge his hand, and for the first time in years, John felt like the future was his again. The past was behind him, and the world ahead was wide open.